The air was cold and the wind carried the smell of fire and metal. As the human soldier named Jace walked slowly through the ruined alien village, his boots crunched broken glass and strange debris with every step, and he kept his rifle low, scanning the silence for danger, though he felt like the only living soul left in the place. Around him, the alien homes were burned and broken, roofs torn open, walls collapsed, wires hanging like dead vines, and there was no sign of life, no sound of people, no voices, no movement, just a deep silence that made his heart beat louder in his chest. Jace had not eaten for 2 days, and his body was weak, but he stayed alert. He moved carefully through the ruins, hoping to find something: food, water, even a clue to where his squad had gone, but the village was empty, like a ghost town swallowed by waterthon. He heard it, a sound so soft, he thought he imagined it at first, a little cry, not loud, more like a whimper, like the sound of someone too scared to scream. He turned quickly, aiming his rifle toward a broken metal crate near the corner of a shattered building. The sound came again, weaker. This time, like someone trying not to be hard. Jace stepped closer, his boots scraping against the stone, and with his free hand he slowly lifted the edge of the crate. His eyes met a pair of big glowing eyes staring up at him, full of fear and hunger and pain, and under the crate was a small alien girl, her skin pale with strange patterns, glowing faintly like light underwater, her arms thin, her face dirty and tired and scared. She did not speak, she only stared, and Jace saw she was holding her stomach, like it hurt, like she had not eaten in days. He looked at her, then at his bag. He had one meal left, a dried food pack, something he was saving for later, but now his hands moved without thinking. He knelt down and held it out to her. The girl hesitated, her eyes flicking from the pack to his face, unsure if it was a trick, if he would hurt her or take it back, but slowly she reached out with shaking hands and took it, and then tore it open with sharp little teeth, eating fast and messy like an animal who had not seen food in too long. Jace sat beside her, not saying anything, just watching as she ate every bite, and then looked at him again, her eyes softer now, no longer full of fear, and when she finished, she looked down, then up again, and reached out one small hand and touched his arm gently, like she wanted to say thank you, but did not know how. He smiled at her, a tired, sad smile, and whispered, "You will be okay." Now she tilted her head, confused by the words, but she seemed to understand something in his voice, and she moved closer and leaned against his side, like she felt safe. There had stayed with her through the night. They sat in silence under the ruined roof, as the stars moved across the sky, and he kept his eyes open, listening for danger, while the little alien girl slept beside him, her breath slow and soft, like a child finally free of fear. In the early morning he felt her stir, and when he opened his eyes, she was already crawling away, moving fast and silent, like she did not want to wake him, and before he could say anything, she was gone, vanished into the shadows of the broken village like a ghost that never really existed. He stood up, looked around, called softly, but there was no answer, no trace, no clue. Just silence and cold wind and empty ruins. A noise behind him made him spin around, and before he could react, strong arms grabbed him, and a voice barked in a language he did not understand. He struggled, but it was too late. The enemy had found him. They dragged him away, their boots loud and rough on the stone, and the last thing he saw before they shoved him into a transport was the place where she had slept, now empty as the ship doors closed and darkness fell over him. Jace held on to one thought: the little alien girl, the soft eyes, the tiny hand on his arm, and the food he gave her when he had almost nothing left. He did not know if she would survive, or if he would ever see her again, but he hoped he had done the right thing, that somehow that small act would matter in a galaxy full of war and pain and loss. And as the engines roared and the ship carried him away, he whispered to the dark, "I hope you make it, little one." The walls of the alien prison were dark and cold, and made of strange stone that hummed softly at night, and Jace sat in the corner of his cell, staring at the ceiling where cracks formed shapes like rivers and trees, and old paths from forgotten maps. He had been here for many years, though he had lost count of the days, long ago. They never told him where he was, or why he was still alive, while others had vanished. He was fed once a day, a bland, thick liquid that smelled like metal, and sometimes he dreamed of real food, of warm air and sunlight, of green fields and human voices. But every time he opened his eyes, it was always the same silence, and stone guards came and went, never speaking his language, never showing faces under their glowing helmets. They watched with cold blue eyes and metal weapons that never slept, and sometimes they took prisoners away and never brought them back. And Jace knew better than to ask questions or fight, because there was no one to help him and no way to escape. His body had grown thin and scarred, and his hair had turned gray at the edges. But his eyes still held a quiet fire, a spark of the man who had once walked through a burned village and gave away his last food to a scared little alien girl. He remembered her face, Even now those big glowing eyes and small hands that reached for his kindness. He often wondered what became of her. Maybe she died alone in the ruins. Or maybe she grew strong and learned to survive. He liked to think she lived and found safety and perhaps even peace, though such things were rare in this broken galaxy. One night everything changed. It began with a deep alarm echoing through the prison halls, a sound he had never heard before, low and sharp, like the roar of a great machine waking from sleep. The ground shook, and the lights flickered red, and the guards began to move fast, shouting in their own tongue, and raising weapons toward the sky. Jace stood slowly, moving to the bars of his cell, and gripping them tightly as the noise grew louder, and the air filled with heat and tension. Something was coming, something powerful, something the guards feared, and he felt his heart beat faster as a strange feeling rose in his chest, a hope he had not felt in years. Explosions shook the building, dust rained from the ceiling, screams and blasts echoed through the halls. And then a bright light burst through the far wall, as part of the structure collapsed, and shadows moved through the dust, shadows that did not walk like guards or move like prisoners. They were fast and strong and glowing with energy that seemed alive. The door to his cell flew open, and a tall figure stepped in. Her armor gleamed like fire, and her face was hidden behind a sharp mask with glowing lines that danced like living veins, and she looked at him for a moment as if scanning him, and then her voice came, clear and strong, in perfect human language. "Where is the human named Jace?" she asked, and he blinked in shock, unable to speak as his name echoed in his mind. Something about her voice, something deep and familiar, like a song he had once heard long ago in a better time. He stepped forward slowly and raised one hand and said, "I am Jace." And the figure paused and then removed her mask, and he saw her face, and the world stopped moving for a moment. She was no longer a child, but he knew her eyes, the same eyes that once looked up at him from the ruins, glowing with light and fear and hunger, now filled with strength and pride and purpose. She was taller now, her skin marked with warrior symbols, and her hair tied back like a soldier from legends, but she was the same girl, the one he saved. Her name is Zalara, and she spoke it proudly as she stepped closer and said, "You gave me life when no one else would, and I have not forgotten. I searched for you through stars and systems, and when I found this place, I came with fire to bring you out." Jace felt something break inside him, a wall of silence and loneliness that had grown for years, and now it crumbled as he looked at her, not as a warrior or alien, but as a friend, as someone who remembered, who cared, who came back. He wanted to speak, but his throat was tight with emotion, so he just nodded and followed her, as more of her people secured the prison, their weapons humming, their movements fast and precise, and he saw other prisoners freed, others saved by the same girl he had once fed. As they reached the ship, she turned to him again and said, "I am not done, Jace. I came for you, yes, but there is more to do. The galaxy needs you, and I cannot do this without you." He looked at her face. The same small hands, now strong and firm, and he knew then that his story was not over, and the stars were calling once more. The stars outside the ship moved slowly, like silver dust floating in the dark, and Jace stood by the window watching them, his hand resting on the cold glass, while his heart tried to understand what had happened, and what was coming next. He had not seen open space in so many years that it looked unreal, like a painting too perfect to believe. Behind him, the sound of soft footsteps made him turn, and there she was, the alien girl, now grown, now a commander, now a legend in armor, her voice calm and strong as she stepped closer and said, "I wanted you to see this first, before we go farther, before we go to war." Jace looked at her and nodded, still not sure what to say, still feeling like he was inside a dream that had taken too long to arrive, and he followed her through the quiet halls of her ship, past alien soldiers, who nodded as they passed past screens showing maps of star systems, past doors that opened with soft hums. They entered a wide room filled with lights and walls of memory, a place where stories lived in images and holograms and history, and she raised her hand and spoke one word, and the room came to life. He saw a younger Zalara, smaller, thinner, still glowing with hunger and fear, running through forests and metal ruins, hiding from monsters and soldiers, scavenging broken cities for scraps. She was alone, but her eyes never lost that light, that spark she held when he gave her food. That day then, he saw her fight, not with anger, but with focus and speed and courage. He saw her train with others, grow stronger, faster, wiser. She never forgot the voice of the human who helped her, and she whispered his name, like a promise before every test, before every mission, before every battle. Jace turned to her as the images faded, and he asked, "Why me?" And she answered without pause, "Because no one else gave me hope, because you were the only one who saw me as someone worth saving, because you gave your last food when you had nothing, and you did not ask for anything in return." He looked away, his voice quiet, and said, I did not think it mattered, and she smiled gently and said it changed everything. They walked again and reached the bridge of the ship where stars shone across the screen, and ships moved in formation like a silent army, waiting for orders, and Zalara stood in front of the map and pointed to a system near the edge of known space. She spoke with Popus, the enemy who locked you away, the ones who burn planets and enslave people. They are building something here. Something powerful, something that can destroy whole worlds, and I plan to stop them. Jess stepped closer and looked at the map and asked, "What do you need from me?" And she said, "You were a soldier once. You know human systems, human codes, human tech. I need that. I need you to help me break what they built." Took a deep breath and nodded slowly, not because he wanted to fight again, but because the fire in her eyes told him this war was not just hers, it was theirs, because the same hands that once begged for food now held the power to save others, and she trusted him to stand beside her. Xalora turned and looked at him one last time before they left the bridge and said, "I am not the child you saved. I am the warrior that child became, and I will not fail you." Jace placed his hand on her shoulder and replied, "Then let us go finish what the stars started." The ship jumped forward, lights stretched, and space folded, and the past moved behind them like dust in the wind, and the future waited ahead with fire and shadow. The sky above the old station was red and gray, with thick smoke rising from torn mountains and shattered towers, and Jace stepped out of the dropship, with Zalara at his side, her armor glowing gently with power and purpose. The wind howled like a broken machine, and dust stung their faces as they moved through the ruins of a once great outpost, built long ago by humans and left behind during the early days of the war. "This place is where it began," Zalara said, her voice low, as her eyes searched the dark halls and cracked stone. "This is where they found the codes, the data, the systems they needed to build the weapon. This is where we will find the key to stop them." Jace walked slowly through the old corridors, his boots echoing on metal floors covered in ash and old bones and forgotten memories. He recognized the design, the markings, the faded banners of Earth's old science division still hanging like ghosts. In the silence he touched one gently and closed his eyes, remembering voices, faces, orders, laughter, pain, all of it buried here under rubble and dust. They passed rooms filled with burned terminals, crushed walls, frozen food rations, long turned to powder, and signs written in his own language, signs that read danger, test zone, clearance required, and emergency shelter. This was once a place of learning and defense, and now it was nothing but ruin. Led him down a spiral tunnel, lit by weak red lights, where no sound followed them, and no guards waited, and at the end of the hall stood a door sealed tight with layers of code and metal. An old human tech. Jace stepped forward and placed his hand on the scanner. The screen flickered, and a voice spoke through the dust and static. "Welcome, Lieutenant." Jace caught her identity, confirmed final message, loaded standby, and the door opened with a deep sigh of steam and time. Inside was a small control room, filled with blinking lights and a single large console covered in warning signs and emergency locks, and in the center, a hollow unit came to life, showing a tired human face. One Jace knew, one he had fought beside, one who had died in the early days of the war. The message played slow and heavy with truth. The man spoke of a weapon, a signal amplifier, something that could bend space around a star and tear gravity apart, something too dangerous to use, but too powerful to ignore. And he said that data had been stolen by mercenaries and sold to those who now seek to rule the galaxy with fear and silences. Turned to Zalara and said, "They used us. They used my people and your pain, and made something worse than death." And she nodded, her jaw tight, her fists clenched, and said, "Then we end it now." But a noise rose from deep below, a sound like claws on steel, like teeth grinding stone, and lights flashed as the walls shook, and a voice filled the room, cold and mechanical and cruel. "Intruders detected, neutralization in process." And from the dark came machine-stall metal guardians with red eyes and long arms and no hearts. They moved fast and without sound, aiming weapons that glowed with deadly heat, and Zalara shouted to cover as Jace dove behind the console, his hands shaking as he pulled out an old pistol still clipped to his belt. The fight was fast and bright and wild as Zalara spun through the air, slicing with her blade that sang like thunder, and Jace fired with calm aim, each shot sparking against steel as they moved together in rhythm, like they had fought side by side for years, not hours. Last machine fell with a heavy crash, and sparks danced in the air as silence returned, and Zalara helped Jace to his feet, her arms strong, her eyes still blazing, and she said, "We need to take the core before they send more." They moved to the center of the room, where the data core glowed like a heart of fire, and Jace linked it to his wristpad, watching the lines of code race across the screen, showing maps, targets, control signals for the weapon buried in a distant system, not yet complete, but closely looked at her and said, "We can stop them, but we need to go now," and she replied, "Then we go and we burn their plans." To Ashas, they left the station behind. The mountains shook again, and the air grew darker, and the stars above seemed to watch and wait, and far away in the cold heart of space, something ancient stirred awake, ready to finish what the war had started. It stood frozen as the screen flickered with images from Earth, and the room around him seemed to vanish, swallowed by the sound of fire, and screams coming from the transmission toll. Buildings he once knew crumbled like paper as ships dark as night dropped fire on the city's people, ran through smoke and ash, their voices lost in the storm of war. His hands clenched as he watched streets turn to dust and old landmarks fall, and even through the static, he could feel the terror and pain as if it were crawling under his skin, and in that moment he forgot the cold ship, the distant stars, the mission ahead, and could only see his home. Crying for help, Solara stepped beside him, silent and still, her eyes fixed on the screen, her breath slow and steady, as she saw the place he had once spoken of, the world he had saved her from, the world he had fed her, in his heart still tied to the soil and wind and warmth of Earth. And she placed one hand on his shoulder, not to comfort but to remind him he was not alone. "The signal is coming from deep orbit," Jace said, his voice low and rough. "They are using a relay system from the dark side of the moon, masking the source behind debris and broken satellites. They are striking without warning, keeping Earth blind and quiet and scared." "Then we will make them hear," Zalara replied, her voice sharp like steel, her eyes already moving to the star map, calling her officers as the plan began to take shape. "We will burn their relay, break their silence, and let Earth know it is not forgotten." Her fleet gathered fast, sleek ships rising from dark hangars, like birds of flame, each one built for speed and strike, not numbers, but purpose and heart. And Jace stood among the crews, watching young soldiers of many races move with focus and fire, trusting Zalara, and now him, to lead them into the storm before launch. Zalara handed Jace a small device, a symbol of command, a simple tool to give orders, to guide ships, and to be heard, and she looked at him and said, "They follow you now, not because you are human, but because you are the one who gave everything when you had nothing." The fleet moved through space like shadows, silent and swift, stars reflecting on their silver hulls as they approached the edge of the moon, where the enemy relay sat hidden behind clouds of wreckage and defense towers that spun slowly in the void, waiting for targets. "They cannot see us yet," Jace whispered, as he studied the enemy layout. "Their blind spots, their timing, their pattern, it is old Earth tech, mixed with stolen alien code, too, focused on brute strength, not enough on smart defense. They thought we would never come from this angle, then now is the time," Zalara said, her blade glowing, as she turned to her crew, her voice rising like thunder. "We strike not for glory, not for power, but for the world that fed us, for the world that raised him, for the world that still fights." The signal was sent, and fire followed her words. Ships burst forward, lasers carving light through the dark. Enemy turrets turned to slow, shields flared and cracked as Zalara's fighters danced through wreckage, turning steel into flame, and silence into Ferragus guided the path, calling targets, giving commands, moving pieces like a master of war. Though his heart burned with more than tactics, it burned with memory of skies blue and grass green, and the sound of music through open windows, things he had lost, things he wanted back. One of the enemy cruisers turned to block them and charged weapons, but Zalara moved in fast, her ship slicing below and striking hard, tearing engines apart, before the blast ever came, and the explosion painted the stars in firelight as the fleet pushed for bridges, reached the relay core, and hacked through the system fast and clean as fingers, flying across the pad as alarms screamed and sparks flew, and then the screen lit up. Green connection, restored Earth line open, and the message sent to any human, to any soldier, to anyone still listening. "Earth is not alone, we are coming, we will not forget, and we will not falter." Signal echoed across the stars, and through broken satellites, and deep into bunkers where survivors hid, and eyes opened, and hope flickered again, and Zalara stood beside Jace as the stars lit behind her armor, and she said, "You gave me hope, now we give it back." And far across the galaxy, deep in the enemy command, a new voice rose, one cold and cruel, and filled with rage, as it whispered, "Find them, and bring me the human who dares call the stars to his side." The fleet moved in silence after the battle lights, low weapons charged ships, floating like ghosts through the black sea of space, and Jace stood near the war table, staring at the map of stars, his hands steady, his eyes locked on the final system, where the weapon was being built, where the enemy waited behind walls of fire and steel. "They are afraid now," he said, "not because we hit them hard, but because we gave Earth a voice again, because we reminded them that kindness does not die." And Zalara stood beside him, Her armor scratched her face, calm but sharp like a blade ready for war, and she said then, "We strike before they can hide again." But before they launched, the alarm rang sharp and strange, not from outside, not from enemy ships, but from inside the ship, and red lights flashed through the hallways as doors locked and systems shut down. Voices cried out in panic and confusions. "Someone has turned against us," one of the officers said. "A breach from within the main core is under enemy control." And Jace felt his chest tighten as he ran toward the engine room. His feet fast, his heart faster, knowing this was no mistake, this was betrayal. They reached the room where wires sparked and flames danced, and in the center stood a figure wrapped in black armor, holding a strange device pulsing with dark energy, and Jace raised his weapon and shouted, "Stop!" But the figure turned slowly and removed the helmet. It was a face he knew, not a soldier, not a fighter, but one of the engineers from the rescue mission, the quiet one, the helpful one, the man who laughed with the crew and shared stories of stars, now holding the device like a knife to the ship's heart. "Why?" Jace asked, his voice low, his eyes locked on the traitor, who smiled sadly and said, "Because peace is weak. Because power is truth. Because I was promised a world where humans rule again, not as beggars, not as heroes, but as kings." Sola stepped forward, her voice cold, her blade glowing, and said, "You would burn kindness for a throne built on ash." And he laughed and said, "I would burn planets if it meant never having to bow to aliens again." And he pressed the trigger. The room shook as the pulse fired, but Jace moved fast, throwing his body into the traitor, knocking the device from his hands as the energy flared and struck the wall with a sound like a star screaming, and pain filled Jace's side, but he did not stop. He fought with fists, with rage, with memory. Alara joined him, her strikes fast and sharp, and together they brought the traitor down. His breath gone, his words fading into dust, and the fire behind him died as the systems came back online and the ship breathed again. Just fell to one knee, blood on his arm, his breath rough, and Zalara knelt beside him, holding him steady, her eyes fierce with worry, but her voice calm, saying, "You did not fall, you stood taller than fear." He smiled weakly and said, "I am not done, not yet, not while that weapon still rises." And she helped him to his feet, and they walked back to the bridge, where the crew waited, eyes wide with shock and respect, and Jace raised his voice and said, "We were betrayed, but we are not broken. We fly now, we strike now." For every word that was silenced, the fleet turned toward the final system, engines glowing like dawn, weapons humming like thunder, and as they moved, the enemy saw them coming and readied their walls, their fleets, their traps. But Jace stood at the front of the ship, looking at the stars, with fire in his heart and steel in his voice. And Zalara stood beside him, a commander, a warrior, a girl once saved by food, now saving the man who gave it. They knew what waited was death and fire and shadows, but they moved forward anyway, not for glory, not for revenge, but for the memory of kindness shared in a ruined village, for the voice of Earth rising again, and for a future where hope did not need a weapon to be heard. The enemy fortress floated near a dying star, surrounded by black towers and giant warships, thick shields wrapped around it like armor made of light and pain. And Jace stood on the command deck, his hands gripping the rail as his heart beat slow and steady, and every screen showed the same truth. The weapon was almost ready, and the time to stop it was next. Alara stood beside him, her armor dark with battle marks, her voice calm as stone. She pointed to the core inside the structure, the place where the power gathered, where space bent and time screamed, where the enemy would unleash destruction on Earth and more if they were not stopped. "Today we go in fast," Jace said, "straight to the core. Take out the stabilizers, blow the power from inside. Only way to make sure it never fires." And her eyes locked with his, and she nodded once, knowing this would not be easy, knowing they might not return, but also knowing there was no other way. The fleet broke through, first weapons firing, ships spinning through fire and debris as they cleared a path to the heart of the fortress. The enemy rose to meet them, machines and cruisers and drones raining down death, but the fleet pushed forward, led by the girl, once fed by kindness, now returned with stars at her back. Jace flew with a small team through a breach in the shield, dodging blasts, moving fast toward the glowing core, guided by old maps and new fire in his soul. And Zalara was with him, cutting down machines like a storm, like a memory given form, her voice clear as she called to the others, her blade a beam of light in the dark inside the core chamber. The weapon pulsed like a living thing, power crackling through the air like lightning chained to rage, and at the center stood the final guardian, a creature born of shadow and metal, a thing built to destroy, and it spoke not with words, but with hate too. "Our dust," the voice said, "your kindness is weakness, your hope is a lie, and you will die forgotten." Jace stepped forward, his body shaking with pain and weight, but his voice never broke, and he said, "I gave my last food to a child who became more than you ever will, and that act echoed farther than your hate ever could. That fight was brutal, fire and blades, and crashing steel as the Guardian struck with fury, and the chamber trembled with every blow, and Jace moved with everything he had left, each step for the child who once looked up at him, each punch for the world, still waiting for Dawn. Zalara fought like flame, her armor cracked, her arm bleeding, but her eyes never lost their light, and when the final moment came, she drove her blade into the core, breaking the seal, unleashing the storm inside, and everything shook, like the universe was crying, "We have to go." Jace shouted as alarms blared and fire burst from every wall, and Zalara turned to him, her breath heavy, her body broken, but her voice strong, and said, "No, you go, you still have stories left to live, and I have one more gift to give." Before he could stop her, she pushed him toward the exit, sealed the door behind him, locked with her command, and smiled once through the glass. Her eyes soft like that day long ago, when she was small and hungry and afraid, and he had reached out with food and hope. The escape pod launched. As the core exploded, lights swallowing the station, the sky lit with fire and stars and silence, and then nothing. Jace landed on Earth weeks later, healed by time, but broken inside. The people cheered and thanked him, but he never cared for that. He only looked at the sky each night, hoping for a voice, hoping for a sign that she somehow made it. Then one day a ship appeared above the city, small and fast and silver, and from it stepped a girl, her armor still glowing, her eyes still bright, and her voice calm as she said, "You fed me once, now let me walk beside you." It was not a dream. It was not a trick. It was her, alive, stronger than ever, carried through the stars by the fire of memory and the strength of what he gave her long ago. Jachi smiled, the first true smile in years, and took her hand, and together they watched the stars move above a world that still lived, a world saved not by weapons or kings, but by one small meal given without asking anything back.